Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the first breakout panel of the DASICON 2023. We have with us quite a stacked deck of people, and I'm very happy to see that. I shall be Anubhav Banerjee, a second-year student from MAIS, from the Diplomatic Academy, and I shall be your moderator for this session. Of course, you're not here to listen to me talk, but you're here to listen to our panelists speak about the very interesting topic of the global market and future developments. And as a student from law and arts, studying a degree in international relations, it's no wonder that there are so many people from our program in this particular session, because the interdisciplinarity that we study here shows us how things like globalization in ecosystems and how diplomacy as an impulse for fostering a global order are all correlated to topics of economics, political science, and whatnot. So it is with utmost pleasure that I will now welcome all of the members of the panel and sort of lay down the rules about how this is going to work. I will briefly introduce every single member of this panel, starting to my right, going to my left, and then we will allow each individual speaker to present their specific topics, after which we will open the floor for questions, wherein I will step in again and sort of explain to you how this works. With all that being said, it is my privilege to warmly welcome Lydia Marie Lienhart, an alumnus of our Academy of the 25th MAIS program. She's currently working as a doctoral researcher at the University of Graz, having finished her MAIS degree just last year and having a background in transcultural communications and applied economics from the University of Graz. And when she's not at the University of Graz or bouncing around Vienna, she can be found on her YouTube channel, where she talks a lot about making information about economics accessible to the general public. And she has a very interesting paper on the effect of free trade agreements on the EU's external agricultural trade, which I think you guys all can keep your eyes out for as we begin. Lydia, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
And to my further right is Mr. Joris Kaiser, if I pronounce that correctly.
Just about.
We are honored to have you here, sir. He is an advisor currently at the Economic Governance at the European Commission, and with an impressive 7 languages on his resume, he has served as a policy coordinator for trade affairs with the government of Turkey in the European Commission, and has a background in economics, an MSc to be specific, from Maastricht University, and has worked at the board of the Association des États Généraux des Étudiants de l'Europe. So he has obviously had a long time supporting student affairs, and therefore we are very pleased to have you back with us. Thank you, sir.
You did your research, nice. Thank you.
And now moving to my left, we have Lena Gerdes. Okay, thank you. I'm surprised I got that the first try, but yes, we are very honored to have her with us. She is a PhD candidate and research associate at the Vienna University of Business and Economics, specifically the Department of Socioeconomics, if I'm not correct. And having completed her MSc in socio-ecological economics and policy, she is also a prolific scholar and has supported student affairs herself through her work at the Association Internationale des Étudiants en Sciences Économiques et Commerciales, and currently works with a very well-known NGO named Attack Austria, which is also involved in talking about many aspects of democracy, economics, and we look forward to her insights about things like unequal exchanges and trade agreements. Thank you for being here. And to my furthest left, it is my honor to welcome Magistra Oliver Prausmüller. He is a policy analyst and researcher and lecturer at on the European Union and International Affairs. He is also very well published with a very interesting paper I read of yours in 2017 on the effect of free trade agreements on water services. And he has been affiliated with the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna from about 2011. So he's also a well-researched, well-established academician. Thank you for being here, sir. And with that being said, I open the floor for Lydia. You are welcome to have your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy that I am back at the Diplomatic Academy. I'm very impressed by my fellow panelists, and I thought I might start off today with a short story. A story about how international trade and the environment could work together, but maybe has not been the case in the past. So when I grew up on a farm, as a teenage girl, I always wondered why there would be apples from Chile in the supermarket where we could grow so much of them at home. And when I asked my mom about that, of course, she explained to me about different wages in different countries and environmental standards. But I considered this really unfair and stupid being an adolescent. As most of you know, in that age, you kind of want to change everything of the world. And so I went on to get a diploma in agriculture, and that was when I realized that questions related to especially agriculture and the environment tend to have highly complex and long answers. And I wanted to inquire more into this, and when I studied economics and international relations, I realized that free trade also can have some advantages. And for instance, in the past, it has contributed to raise per capita income and create jobs, especially in Europe. For instance, the Austrian EU integration since 1989 has led to the effect that in Austria today, per capita income is now 28% higher than it would have been without EU integration. And also, there's a lot of academic research that in general, free trade agreements lead to increased prosperity and less likelihood of war. And of course, as with anything in life, in the past, free trade agreements had many bad effects as well on society, and especially the environment and the climate. I guess most of you know that feeling when you start to realize that the coin has two sides. And so when I continued on with my studies, I also saw the detrimental effects trade agreements could have. Of course, these are mostly related to society, the environment, or the climate. Frequently discussed right now, where there's many critique that it lacks on the chapters on corporate due diligence, or efforts to have deforestation-free supply chains for goods that to be exported into the EU. So, of course, such examples, and when trade agreements don't address the environmental effects and the climate effects they can have, then they can lead to very bad side effects besides the fact that they increase GDP. But does it have to be this way? Can international trade also be related to and contribute to sustainable development? I guess most of you have already asked yourself that question, otherwise you would not be here today. And from my point of view, the answer is neither black nor white, but all the shades of gray. And the question is rather for being a yes or no question, free trade agreements, I would say the question is on how we want them. And basically, a free trade agreement is an international treaty, and within the rule of law, you can put anything in there. And so also we must not forget that, for instance, the EU has a huge negotiating power when it comes to such trade agreements. Just as an example, the EU's GDP is 6 times bigger than the Mercosur GDP. So in these trade negotiations, of course, for the Mercosur countries, it's very a huge goal to access that huge consumer market the EU offers. So there, we as the EU have a huge leverage and a huge power, which we could use in such negotiations. And I'm giving some crazy examples here, but it's all possible if we wanted. For instance, Brazil is planning to reduce their CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030, and also the EU is planning to reduce their emissions by 55% by 2030. We could include clauses that these goals have to be met in a trade agreement, for instance. If you would make that, for instance, essential provision to get the international law text right. If that's an essential provision, a violation thereof would even have the possibility to trigger sanctions or a suspension of the agreement. So such formulations and such pressure, for instance, would also lead to a higher pressure on the participating countries to adhere to their own goals in the Paris Agreement. So here, trade agreements could even be a leverage to help really set into force other commitments under international law. And the same goes to, for instance, the International Labour Organization's conventions on biodiversity. So here, I think the key is, or also, for instance, requiring a certification scheme for products to be exported to the EU that, for instance, could certify that products are deforestation free. So here the devil is definitely in the detail. Theoretically, a lot is possible in a treaty text. And yeah, the point is that the EU right now already trades a lot with, for instance, Mercosur countries or also other countries, especially in agricultural trade. We trade more with countries where we don't have a free trade agreement as the EU. And so the question is whether we would, whether it would not be better to have a free trade agreement that would govern the trade that already exists. So here we could be critical because already 200,000 tons of beef are imported from Brazil to the EU annually. And so what about like having an agreement that would govern these imports more and would have stronger regulations on that? Yeah, and today I'm now a researcher and I'm spending all my day inquiring into questions like this. And for me, the most important point is that also we as citizens have to be interested in all these shades of gray of free trade agreements, because it's one thing to put our head in the sand and say, no, they're all bad, and then other people will dictate what's in the treaty text. So it's also up to our engagement and our demands to the policymakers to demand what we want from such agreements and what we want to be part of treaty texts. So yeah, if you take one thing with you from my talk today, it is that, I mean, most of you know a thing or two about international agreements. We're here at the Diplomatic Academy, right? Any treaty can be done well, even a free trade agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Very interesting, sort of not going with an all or nothing approach, but trying to look at how we can leverage existing trade infrastructures to sort of avoid the problems of externalities that sort of get wiped away under the calculus of like how trade is useful. With that being said, Mr. Kaiser, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And like I said, you did your research. I have to congratulate first of all you guys, the organizers, actually, for having put on this show. I was a student in Maastricht and did much the same, as you said, as part of a student organization as well. In fact, I did a 10 years conference on the Maastricht Treaty, which obviously was in my then hometown, right? And so I just, I appreciate the amount of work that goes into this, basically. So that's all I'm saying. So thanks very much for that.
That is appreciated.
Good morning to all of you. Yeah, I'll go back a step or two, but I'm certainly very interested in how the discussion evolves, obviously with our co-panelists, but also obviously with all of you, right? So interactive and everything. I very much look forward to the discussion. Introductions have been made, so I won't go over that again. I will go back a step or two, namely to the geopolitics. Obviously, in the introductions, it already came up. A new reality. There was the vicious attack by Russia under Putin just about a year ago on the 24th of February, just last week, Friday. We celebrated in the Haus der Europäischen Union back in the representation of the Commission here in Vienna, the sad anniversary of that. But of course, the war has been going on since 2014. Just to recall that, and Russia's aggression has been going on for even longer than that, to 2008, namely, when they invaded the independent country of Georgia already, right? Under unfortunately the same dictator figure that is now killing people on a daily basis. So that is the sad reality of the geopolitics today. Just want to remind all of us basically of that. Having said that, going back now to the title of the conference, Globalisation, obviously, but also our panel, quite ambitious in the sense of like balancing economic growth and environmental protection now, right? I'll get to how the two link certainly, but it's a broad subject, and as was already said in the introductions as well, it doesn't necessarily even concern only growth. I think Ambassador Briggs said very nicely that obviously our exchange, with our sort of multicultural, interdisciplinary exchange today is also made possible by this kind of thing. And there is, frankly, a degree of friction between that, right? I mean, all of us, I took the bicycle here today because I can, sort of thing, but certainly that wasn't possible for all of us. So there's a friction even to this degree of not even economic growth, but basically just human exchange, right? Okay, so now getting to the substance then, because what I want to describe as a matter d'office, let's say, like, that's my job basically, is EU action with regard to all of this. So when President von der Leyen came into the current commission in 2019, she obviously proclaimed the European Green Deal as one of the major, I would say the major really, political priority basically of the current commission, right? On the back of that, as a response to the COVID crisis, we have formulated a program that's called Next Generation EU that focuses on the green and digital transition. With at the heart of that, what I work on mostly in my day job, shall we say, the recovery and resilience facility. So that's individual plans that exist for every single member state, including Austria, obviously. And that once again finances notably the green and digital transition, but also induces reforms in member states, quite importantly. So in Austria, for instance, what the financing is about is, for instance, exchanging heating systems. So that's noticeable with consumers and with small businesses, but also the reform of the ecological tax reform, introducing for the first time in Austria a carbon price, for instance, right? So speaking of environment protection and particularly limiting, obviously, emissions. So that was in reaction to initially, shall we say, the COVID-induced economic and social crisis that has now, obviously, with the Russian invasion, the renewed invasion, I would say, as of last year, morphed into a lot of focus on energy, and that is under the normer, as far as the EU is concerned, Repower EU. So that combines a whole lot of measures that we take in the realm of energy. It is first and foremost to get away from Russian fossil fuels, obviously, but also still under the norm of getting away from fossil fuels too cool. So that is the immediate actions to diversify away from Russia, to push massively the renewable energy, basically, so the building up of that capacity. And third, and I would say actually foremost, because that will feed back into the discussion that we're about to have as well, energy efficiency, so basically saving energy. Clearly not only the cheapest, but also the cleanest energy is that which we don't use in the first place, right? It doesn't have to be produced in any shape or form, not by fossil, but also not by renewables that, after all, also consume resources in some fashion, and we'll get to that in the trade part, shall we say. So lastly then, just this year, or just this past month, on the 1st of February, in fact, we, the European Commission, introduced the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan. That has, in turn, 4 pillars. We like our pillars. That's the tenets that EU programs are typically based on. So that's a conducive regulatory environment, which is what the EU is all about. Funding, that's partly about the competitiveness, and we may get to that because, of course, part of the background to the industrial plan was, frankly, the so-called IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act from the US administration, which also provides subsidies. So that's what the funding item is about. Skills item, so we need green skills. We need people that can actually install that renewable capacity, for instance. And then those are the sort of the more or less domestic items, shall we say, getting to what we call net zero industry. Obviously, it's already been spoken about that the entire continent aims to be climate neutral by 2050, sorry. Austria aims to do that by 2040. Getting to that clearly will involve major efforts anyway, sort of thing, and a lot of that is going to be with industry. In order to keep competitive industry, both competitive and get to that clean bit, basically, to the net zero in particular. There's certainly also funding required, but lots of other stuff as well. So those were the more or less internal parts. And then the fourth and last part, which I'll get to now, is the item of trade. And that's what I think the panel will. I've been here since September 2021, and previous to that, I was part of DG Trade. And in that capacity had the privilege really to be working on trade agreements, as Lydia just explained to myself. I didn't work on Mercosur, but I did work on Turkey in particular, as you kindly pointed out, and Uzbekistan, which is an interesting example here, because for one thing, of course, Uzbekistan is one of the geopolitical kind of not ground zero essentially, but one of the certainly contested areas, in particular as Russia would certainly claim it as a sphere of influence, let's say. China is in the vicinity and obviously is a large user of resources. And this is where the EU comes in, and that's what makes this so interesting. I think it's a prime example of exactly the kind of thing that Lydia was talking about. We've got trade negotiations that I was conducting myself, so, faceless bureaucrat and so on and so forth, here I am, with Uzbekistan, and they're in the sort of position somewhat, not so similar to Mercosur even, let's say, like, but really from a position where they didn't conceive of international agreements, for instance, in the realm of, you know, climate action, let's say Paris, you know, UN, FCCC, and so on and so forth. And so this kind of thing, like these kind of texts, is a chapter, a trade and sustainable development, a TSD in the parlance chapter that we typically discuss with these countries. This year is the Mercosur chapter, in anticipation of our discussion a little later. But a similar one we negotiated really with Uzbekistan as well. And the term negotiation here, of course, is a very significant one, and that's why I mentioned again the geopolitical sphere. Because it is a negotiation, it is a give and take. Mercosur, for instance, will be interested in something, we will be interested in something. We, I think, are among the only economic powers, certainly on the planet, that actually induce values in our trade agreements as well. Most recently, we concluded one with New Zealand. That obviously is a very good example because New Zealand is more or less of our mindset, let's say. That's what we call like-minded and so on. But other than that, and certainly as a major power, we're the only one that actually talk about these things. And that's not only what we need resources and so on and so forth, but it's also what we want. We want other countries to sign on to this kind of thing. There's other initiatives that I can talk about, like the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment.
I'm going to have to ask you to finish within the next 1 or 2 sentences, if that's all right.
Okay, in that case, I will. So I'm happy to talk about my experiences more, obviously. Just to note that the EU has already done a lot. Obviously, we're deeply committed to that aim of carbon neutrality and the net zero industry in particular. Trade agreements can be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I happened to visit Uzbekistan because my mother works in Tashkent just this December, and it's sort of striking what you talked about because it's still something that then sort of bring up how trading with Europe sort of changed the way they, for example, had to introduce child labor laws, for example, in local like agricultural sectors. So yeah, like this value-based trade negotiation, it is definitely a USP of the European Union, and some of the initiatives that you listed out, pretty informative. With that being said, I now ask Ms. Gerdes, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also really happy to be here to talk to you today. And I'll teaser a few critical points that I can think about when in the broad context of economic growth, environmental protection, and trade. So a lot of the concepts I can't go in depth, but I'm really happy to talk about all of these aspects in the discussion later. Let's see. What is the context and the problem that we are facing? So we live in a growth-driven society. What you see here are 3 lines, which are the global GDP, the global material footprint, so all of the resources that we are using in order for our consumption needs, and also the global CO2 emissions based on fossil fuel industries. And what is just striking to see is that economic development, especially GDP development, and nature consumption are very closely linked. So they are basically developing in the same direction. And related to that, we also have a steep increase in the global material flows. So in all the resources that we need, we saw a huge increase in the past 50 years. So all the different lines and dots are different materials. In all these areas, we see a strong increase in the consumption and extraction of these resources. As well, connected to trade, so we have a huge increase in trade as well in the past 50 years. Resources, materials, and consumption goods and intermediary goods are traded all around the globe. And this has serious implications for all the countries that are involved in trade. As already earlier, there are a lot of trade agreements, implications that this trade has on all the participants. And I would like to introduce you very briefly to an idea which is called the ecological unequal exchange. So the idea that trade is not necessarily beneficial for all participating partners, but that trade always has some ecological and social consequences, especially when we talk about resource extraction. So at the places where the resources are extracted, which are to a large extent countries of the Global South, we face social and ecological implications such as deforestation, pollution, labor exploitation. Some of you might have still in mind happenings like the Rana Plaza collapse a few years ago, the collapse of dams in Brazil, mine problems in Congo. So there are a lot of a lot of social and ecological consequences. However, the benefits from this trade are still to a large extent enjoyed by the global north. So we profit from this, the exploitation of resources and of labor in other places, while we have the economic benefits from it, because often the more complex goods have more revenues than just the export of primary goods. And on the second hand, on the other hand, we also can enjoy the consumer goods that we traded all around the globe, and which are based on these extractive happenings. So basically, in our societies, we see an externalization of the social and environmental impacts that our consumption is based on. And now, when we look at some dominant approaches, it's often talked about the idea of green growth. So green growth is supposed to make everything better. It's the idea of we can just continue as we are doing by making everything a little bit greener, a little bit fairer. And the basic idea is that we would need, for actual green growth, we would need to decouple economic growth from environmental impacts. The economic activity, that would be the top line that you see there, would be growing, while at the same time the use of resources, the use of environmental impacts would grow at a different, or would develop differently. And there are different aspects of this decoupling. So a relative decoupling of resources would mean that the resource input is just growing slower, but it's still growing, and that's what we are mainly seeing now. However, when we talk about so-called absolute decoupling, while the economic activity is growing, our resource use and environmental impacts would actually decrease. So the direction of the development would be different. Now, is there empirical evidence for green growth? Because if we're talking about achieving that, we should look at some data. And some colleagues, or Habal et al., they looked at over 800 papers actually studying data on decoupling of the economic growth and environmental impacts. And they found that relative decoupling, so that the economy is growing and that the resource use is just growing a little bit slower, is can be frequently found for material use. However, the absolute long-term decoupling is very rare. And within their study, they conclude that a large and rapid absolute reduction of resources and greenhouse gas emissions cannot be achieved through observed decoupling rates. And therefore, they conclude decoupling needs to be complemented by sufficiency-oriented strategies and strict enforcement of absolute reduction targets. So we cannot just continue growing as we are growing now. And some other authors also find that theoretically it is possible in the short term to actually achieve green growth. However, in the long run, this is really difficult. And an efficiency increase often leads to a so-called rebound effect. So whenever it's easier and cheaper to use energy and resources, we tend to just use more of them. So in the end, the effect is that we use more resources. All materials need to be replaced at some point, and the renewable energy infrastructures might not emit as much CO2 emissions, but they are all based on resources. So we still need resources to build our wind parks and to build our solar panels. Moreover, we always need land for all of these aspects as well. So why do we still talk about green growth so much then? Well, I brought you a quote that I thought was quite nicely summarizes it. So it's from Timothy Parikh, and he's saying, the story of decoupling is reassuring. It is a don't worry, everything is fine, everything is going to be okay kind of thing to say. And this is precisely why that story is dangerous. As ecosystems are getting nightmarishly worse, the fable of green growth is acting as a kind of macroeconomic greenwashing, especially when mobilized to discredit other more radical solutions to the ecological crisis.
I'm going to have to ask you to
I'll wrap there.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's why it's really important to question the ideas of green growth, and that's why we also have to be critical of or question trade agreements. I'll just very briefly go to the. Oh, sorry, someone wanted to take a picture. I'll just go back. So when we talk about trade agreements, we really have to keep in mind that we can't just base our trade agreements on the aim of continuously growing. So also Mercosur has the aim of increasing trade between the EU and the Mercosur region to increase the trade, especially of beef and other agricultural products. And we still have to keep in mind that this would exacerbate the environmental destruction. It would increase human rights violations and has a detrimental effect on prices both in the Global South or in the Mercosur area and here. That's, we can go into that in the discussion then, but I would like to conclude with the idea that generally many trade agreements actually hinder an ecological transition and speed up the climate catastrophe. And that's why we really need to fight for better treatments that are actually looking at poverty and climate change and ensure human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gerdes. I mean, this is also like the sort of conundrum that many in the global south, such as my own country, we sort of struggle with this problem, where agendas on development and growth are all still focused on things like the demographic dividend that India is expected to hit. And it's still difficult to convince state actors, political actors, that we need to cut down on economic growth because we're already suffering from ecological consequences, which makes it that we will never reach those targets before these consequences become too much for economies to bear. It's a very difficult sort of struggle, and I sort of expect that this will sort of be fleshed out a little bit more in the discussion. And again, I must apologize for interrupting you so often, but it's just so that we have more time for the audience to sort of put forward questions to you. And therefore, in the interest of time, I will now welcome Magister Oliver. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me. First things first, kudos to the Diplomatic Academy Students Initiative for this highly topical conference and panel. I have some good news. A lot of input and food for thought, but there will be little globalization and the challenges ahead. And I will build, there are three building blocks. First, I try to untangle the so-called deglobalization debate. Secondly, I try to point out somehow deglobalization at work. Three short spotlights. And thirdly, an outlook of what does deglobalization and the current polycrisis mean for the imperatives of social ecological transformation. And I think this will fit nicely to our discussion. So maybe one further remark, and then without further ado, we'll get directly into the topic. All these inputs, and especially the upcoming spotlights, are drawing heavily on the research work we are doing at the Chamber of Labor Vienna in my department, EU and International Affairs, and in our research networks. For example, with TU Vienna, WU Vienna, or the Austrian Foundation for Development, ÖFSE. So if you're interested to get deeper into the topic, everything is out there, the studies, the research, the policy papers. So let's get into the deglobalization debate, how to make sense of deglobalization. And of course, there are some propositions how to approach globalization, deglobalization, and we're witnessing a time of polycrisis. This is something nothing new to you. Think also about the introductions to this conference, and we have to think about the deglobalizing impact. Where does it come from? And of course, I call it the so-called 3 Cs. There is the COVID-19 crisis as an important trigger. Conflict is a very broad concept, but most strikingly think about the war in Ukraine. And of course, the climate crisis, which is a very important, maybe the strongest driver, if we are serious about the challenges of the climate crisis, for a regionalization of economic activity. Then secondly, this is my suggestion how to cope with the deglobalization term and debate. I think we have to make a difference between deglobalization as a kind of buzzword. This was already the problem in the so-called globalization or hyperglobalization debate, and an analytical category. And I'm, as you may already see more on the analytical part. I think we need a sober approach, dry analysis, and the deglobalization can tell us something about challenges which are already happening or changes. And we have to be very accurate about how to discuss deglobalization. And if we are too judgy about the term deglobalization, we miss the opportunity to discuss deglobalization in a reasonable manner. To give an example, if it's about the regionalization of value chain, we can discuss about a specific topic, think about the COVID-19 crisis and the reorganization of global value chains. Issues like reshoring, bringing back production, for example, to Europe, nearshoring, and all this stuff. Or secondly, the issue of upgrading critical infrastructure protection. Think again about the COVID-19 pandemic. The so-called renaissance in Austria, Germany, of Daseinsvorsorge. What keeps our economy running? What are the foundations of our societies and of our welfare? And thirdly, this is a trend I will address in the spotlight also, the expansion of so-called investment screenings. For example, if we discuss about deglobalization, the area of the free movement of capital, again, we have to look at a specific dimension, then there is a broad trend around the world that governments try to get a foot in, to get back control over their critical infrastructure. Maybe it's FDI screening or Investitionskontrolle in Austria, in Germany, the harbor of Hamburg, or think about the whole issue of energy security or Russian influence, which was already mentioned as a highly sensitive topic. And to come to a conclusion, I think we have to make a difference and somehow also to have a decision whether we want to shape deglobalization, because it's already happening. It's not enough if we like it or not in the specific dimension to discuss. And is it deglobalization by disaster or by design? And is it up, for example, to what right-wing forces? Think about economic nationalism of Trump, for example. Think for us, yeah, you know what I mean. Or is it by design? We take the opportunity to shape the deglobalization discourse. So this is somehow the introduction and how to approach the deglobalization issues at stake. 3 short spotlights, and I will be very quick on that, even in respect to the moderator and to our upcoming discussion. Spotlight 1, the regionalization of economic activity as response to increasing vulnerability. And this is, of course, think about the supply chains disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Think about going to the pharmacy and not getting the antibiotics at need. Or think about the more recent conflict over weaponized interdependence when you think about the energy supply of Europe and the gas dependency from Russia. But this is a highly uneven process. And you have, for example, also this discussion about regionalization, and this is one expression of deglobalization in the sphere of the production of vaccines. And the whole pandemic experience also reminds us on this highly uneven access on a global level to vaccines, and that we are all in this together, and no one is safe until everyone is safe. Yeah, it's not that, it was a very uneven answer to this global effort. Then this is builds on a you have to be cautious about that, but it builds on a study by McKinsey. And you have a risk like acute climate change, chronic climate change. Yeah? It's the climate, immediate climate disasters, but also the long-term changes, which were already thoughtfully figured out. It's about macroeconomic imbalances, trade disputes. The pandemic was already mentioned, and this means, of course, polycrisis has come to stay, and we have to be serious how to address this new environment. Second spotlight, this is once again the issue of how governments try to get or regain public control over critical infrastructure and the return of investment screening. The ownership, we may also address it as the public ownership question is back, and how, for example, governments which highly privatize critical infrastructure get back control. Of course, one attempt is to get back public stakes or equities, but another is this return of investment screening, and you see this whole investment screening wave also across Europe. Spotlight 3 for hurrying up. It's also a third to Vienna. What are stumbling blocks for social ecological transformation? What is needed more and what is needed less? And it's somehow also the foundation, the substance for discussing what we have to unroll in the green transformation and the social ecological transformation, and what we have to roll back. This is somehow a topic often avoided in so-called win-win rhetorics. And think again also about, this simply means if I'm bold on that, shrink or sink. Think about the fossil sector. Which sectors have to become more systemic relevant, and which sectors have to become systemically irrelevant if you think about the fossil sector? And in the study conducted by Lienhart, Blank, and others, there is the basic thesis also built on the COVID-19 crisis, but also the whole discussion about security of supply, what keeps our daily lives running, that we have to, of course, re-evaluate care work. The work in often unpaid work in private households. We have to expand public services, infrastructure, essential local provisions and production, and we have to rebuild our so-called export economies or export sectors. For example, also in the Green Deal of the European Commission, the potentials of circular economy, of recycling, but also the potentials, think about, of renewable energies to get your trade balance right, and so on. And of course, this is the only, what has to shrink, and think for example about the rentier economy. The speculative business at hand, but this is not simply a simple distinction between sectors. If we think, for example, about green finance, very topical also, how to finance the social ecological transformation. Of course, it's also a Trojan horse when it gets up to financialization and to the rentier economy. So we have also to be careful where all those investments have to come from for this social ecological change. And therefore, I come now to an end, also to meet somehow the timeline. My outlook that I think resilience and strategic autonomy are of course, contested concepts in a series of policy areas right now. Think about trade. We already mentioned the Mercosur agreement and its the investments. Think about the example of investment screening, industrial plan policy. Think about the Green Industrial Plan now of the European Commission or the IR Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Then secondly, the move towards selective deglobalization can be understood as a part of a broader resilience paradigm. There's a new resilience paradigm, but which resilience paradigm? And there is a very interesting intervention by Thea Roberts and others. What comes after neoliberalism? And this is their intervention. Resilience is at the heart. Then thirdly, right now we're witnessing an over-dominance of securitization and geopolitical fragmentation, and this leaves little room for policy alternatives, or to be more bold on that, geopolitics eats climate crisis for breakfast. That's the immediate danger. Yeah? And so I conclude with the key issue at stake: how to regain policy space for social ecological transformation by design and cooperation instead of by disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. It's again very sort of insightful, where you look at the issue being looking at reframing the discussion instead of wanting a paradigm shift, identifying that that's already sort of happening, and instead of being reactive, try to sort of recontextualize how we create a system that accelerates what we consider to be. All right, I thank all four panelists. This was for each and sort of a broader theme of degrowth. Now I will have time for the audience to take out their pens and unleash their respective mad gadflies. The way this works is I will ask, or I will collect questions in groups of 3. If you have one, please raise your hand. You will be recognized in order. Please introduce yourself and either mention if you want to ask the question generally or to a specific panelist. If you want to ask it generally, I would invite at least 2 speakers to sort of take the question. If not, then we can, of course, continue on the discussion as it were. So with that being said, I now open the floor. Are there any questions? First, second, anybody else? Okay, so you have the floor.
Are we also allowed to make a comment?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Okay, great. My question is to each panelist: are you optimistic or pessimistic? Because you're going to have to deal with this problem. I don't have to deal with it. I'm too old. But I worked for one of the first ecological presidents in America, Jimmy Carter, and so I was optimistic then. I was also much younger then. Now I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I look at my country when the Congress is about to pass legislation, although it'll be vetoed, against ESG, for example. And I think about what Shakespeare wrote, that the fault, dear Brutus, is in our stars, and not in our stars, but in ourselves. So, and I look at COP27, which I didn't think was very successful in my view. So I'm not very optimistic, and I think it's partly because when you look at various institutions, the decision makers are bombarded by lobbyists, but the industry has much more money than, let's say, pro-social groups that you probably would identify with. So I'd like to know, I'm pessimistic. I'd like to know if you're optimistic or pessimistic and why. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Would you?
Right, Tyler Salvador, I want to follow up on the previous question. And basically, I wanted to point it to Tim's intervention, but built on the one of Lena. So this is really this because I share the idea that I think green growth in the end is not attainable. So there will be some changes made in the end. So my question is there actually among the civil servants within the European Union or the European Commission some sort of awareness or increasing awareness that maybe these trade agreements also with the focus of green growth are not the way forward. I can understand now that this is a bit a bridge too far to include in the agreements, but it might be interesting for us to know if there's actually among the civil servants more and more an idea like, well, this is not going to work. So this might, of course, then coming back to some sort of positive idea about the future might also sort of create some foundation for change in the coming next 10 years, that there's more conviction to take a different approach.
Thank you for your question. You have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to have a quick question to Lena Gerdes. It was a really interesting presentation, and thank you for it. It was really eyes-opening approach. I was maybe struggling about some of the mechanics that you were presenting. If I understood it correctly, all the decoupling leads to regrowth or growth, and economic growth, as as a causal consequences of ecological diminution. So my question is, do you think there is a possibility that we simply don't think about growth from the material perspective, from, let's say, more, let's say, service-oriented perspective, because the modern societies are shifting usage of material more to the services. So from the economic perspective, the modern societies are capable to grow without using the materials. I mean, using materials when we are turning them into waste. So how does it work? I mean, the whole concept of the coupling with, for example, circular economy, and how circular economy as a concept work with this whole dynamics you're presenting?
Okay, thank you for your question. Which of the panelists would like to take the optimism question? Okay, you can start.
Sure. So on the optimism and pessimism, I can be brief, obviously. I take it that you mean optimism, pessimism with regard to, let's say, the fate of the planet, right? Okay, so the cop-out, obviously, is I'm realistic. A little more specific, honestly, I struggle to be optimistic. Because, as I said in my opening statement, this is not only about economic growth, this is also about individual behavior. And, you know, we, by and large, are obviously the privileged few, right? I think our moderator already mentioned how much more of a struggle this is basically in other nations, right? We are not containing our individual behavior. And once again, this is not only about economic growth, this is also about the fact that we are all here, you know, I mean, and that the exchange is very nice, but it basically leads to emissions, you know, long story short sort of thing. So the answer to your question is I struggle to be optimistic. Should I take the other question already as well, or?
I mean, I'd like another response to that, and then we can move on to the second. I think both of you can go. Sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I'd really like to be optimistic about it. I see all the challenges, but I also see a lot of different aspects of transformation. And when we look at what is needed for transformation, there's a theory that says, okay, there are three aspects. So a transformation can happen within a system, a transformation can happen in alternative spaces, or through disruption. And I feel in all these directions, we can see things happening. So there are ideas of the Green Deal, for example, who try to, on the political level, try to make something different. There are alternative spaces like small cooperatives, alternative groups who try to live in a different way. And we see disruption happening through climate strikes. Like today is a huge climate strike in Vienna. If anyone wants to go in the lunch break, or the strikes of the last generation, for example. So I think there is something happening, and I would really like to keep that as a hopeful outlook somehow.
Yeah, Lydia?
In German, there's a term called Zweckoptimismus. So we basically have no choice, I would say. As a young generation, we have no choice than to be optimistic. Even though it's hard, we have to. Like, if we don't, who will? And so what I think is important about this is that, as you already mentioned, we are quite a privileged bubble here. And when talking about policy options, we really need to remember that they need majorities, political majorities, to be stable. And so that's when anything we talk about trade, we need to think about how people on the street perceive trade and which fears they have. And so there I see if we manage to have a focus to keep everybody on board, or a majority on board, then we can go ahead with Zweckoptimismus.
I'm with her. Yeah, I'd like to be with you as well on that, but now we move to the second question, or the question of, would you also like to? Yeah.
Maybe the short answer is, I hold it with Antonio Gramsci, Italian Marxist, optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect, but what are drivers maybe for optimism? Fridays for Future, the global climate strike happening today was already mentioned, social movements, and the appraisal to change by young people. And secondly, if we go more on the institutional and official level, recent heading in the US debate was that the semiconductor industry tries to get rid of environmental regulation and says simultaneously to the Biden administration, listen, you want to get independent from China, but then you have to soften the environmental regulation for a sector. But there are strong signals from the Biden administration that they want to stay on this kind of progressive conditionality, for example, in the case of environment, but open-ended issue. But an issue for pessimism, because we already, the pandemic is over for us, and we're sitting here and it's a lively debate. But I want bring in once again the uneven form of this pandemic on a global level. And this also means it was a multilateral shame what was happening about the distribution of global vaccines. And it was also a shame what was happening in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization. So there is the big pessimism also right now for, is there any multilateral perspective?
Right, thank you, Minister. Sort of caps off both sides of whether you should be optimistic or not.
A quick point on this. In the next section, I will speak about engineering awareness, because the point is behavior and using technology to make us behave in awareness of what is the impact of our singular action on the environment and society. So this will be engineering awareness, a topic on the next section, to link it.
I suppose it's an incentive for our audience to stay on for the next panel as well. Thank you for that, sir. Can we move on to the second question about awareness? I think it was mainly directed towards you, but if anybody else wants to also take that, in addition, they're free to. So you have the floor.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. The question, just to recall, was whether there's increasing awareness on the part of, I think, also personally kind of EU civil servants, let's say, right? But a little more broadly, the entire bubble, let's say, of decision makers, if you want to call it that, right? Of just the depth of the problem that we have, and specifically, obviously, with regard to a trade agreement. Now, the longer answer on that is that, of course, we did revolutionize trade policy already. Okay, revolutionize, I take back. We evolved trade policy, very particularly with the trade policy review. That's a little wonkish, let's say, but the Commission staff, very specifically worked on a kind of realistic, obviously, very much to Lydia's point, sort of thing, but realistic and motive-driven, value-driven, towards the green transition, basically, sort of thing, trade policy. So that was the TPR, the trade policy review, and even more specifically, the review of the TSD, the chapters that I already mentioned, trade and sustainable development, and just how we can go about making that more, as also I think Lydia already said, more binding, essentially. Because, I mean, again, right, Mercosur does have one of these chapters. It does quote, adherence to multilateral environment agreements. That's literally an article of the chapter already, right? But the criticism, obviously, is mostly about, just how binding that is, what exactly that means, right? So yes, the awareness is absolutely there. Now, going into this sort of the more pessimism, and also obviously turning that a little bit into a question, just what is the alternative? I mean, this geopolitics eats climate crisis for breakfast, yes. But what is the alternative? We have to defeat Russia, because otherwise we can't worry about anything else, quite frankly, right? I mean, liquidity will kill you quick, and I mean, a soldier right in front of you sort of thing just beats, your concern about whether or not you're emitting emissions just now. That's the way it is. So, I mean, if you have an alternative to suggest, then because that, I have to say, obviously tempered, not the awareness, obviously, but certainly just the urgency of, what exactly is driven by Russia's attack. The climate crisis for breakfast, yes, it does.
But would you?
Just to be very practical about this, what is the alternative? I come back to this telling example about the semiconductor industry in the US. And will they be successful in getting rid of environmental regulation? Yes or no? And the alternative is to be serious and to be bold on environmental issues. Because if the Biden administration just goes for the argument, you are dependent from the semiconductor industry. If you want to get independent from China, then this is a kind of blackmail. And when this blackmail starts, where will it end? So there is some space for policy and to make a difference. Otherwise, and this is for me also a very geopolitical issue, the China argument of the semiconductor industry and not to be blackmailed by securitization or by geopolitical arguments.
Would that suffice as a
No,
counterfactual
unfortunately it
view?
doesn't, because I mean my question was what is the alternative, and I didn't hear one yet. To be a little bit more specific, and also I think to include Lena and then.
Just to be more precise in your field of work, there's a discussion about the Green Industrial Plan of the European Commission, and of course there's again the issue of corporate capture and what are the conditionalities for those subsidies, and you make a difference. That's the alternative, to be very accurate about progressive conditionalities in the environmental sense, but also on job guarantees, for example, as condition for subsidies and so on. For me, this is very practical. The alternative is to be serious about these issues, and again, the so-called green companies, or someone hopes to be them, green companies have very much leverage right now, and to be powerful opposition also from the side of governments, but also from the European Commission to those attempts for corporate capture.
I don't want to monopolize now, but
That's all right. I mean, what I'm sort of getting at is there is this discussion of whether we do have a counterfactual to whether or not there is a sort of priority in terms of, okay, do states sort of have to follow certain yardsticks? And I guess as a moderator, I'm not really sure where I personally lie on this, because I guess the other problem I have is with communication of priorities, because when public policymakers are sort of working on stuff like this, what do they convey to their sort of electorates? How do they sort of explain their policies? Also makes these discussions like very sort of model in a way. But anyways, thank you for this interactive sort of discussion on this question. Ms. Lena, I guess the next question was for you. Feel free to answer that.
And I think the answer is both an answer to you, but also to your question, because that's quite well linked. So I do think that we cannot just continue with GDP growth-focused economies. But that doesn't mean that nothing else can grow. So the question is, how do we redefine what we need as a society, and how do we define what well-being is? If we always link the well-being of a society to GDP growth and economic growth in general, then it will be linked to the more resource extraction. But okay, what areas, as you already talked about in your presentation, which areas where do we need less? For example, exports of meat all around the globe, while we could easily sustain ourselves by local production. And at the same time looking, okay, which areas we would need to increase and focus on, like the care sectors, like recreational areas, like talking about work time reductions, and all of these aspects that focus more on, okay, what do we need as a society to actually to do well, not focused on our consumption of goods that are not needed for the basic consumption. So I think this shift of perspective would be really important to answer and to tackle in order to address some of the very big questions. I mean, it's a vague answer, I guess. But I think that is the starting point from where we would need to think about. So a trade agreement that increases the export and import of meat doesn't add to this larger idea, I think. And it continues with the growth ideas, I think.
Can I?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I mean, the answer is for everybody to be nice. Sure. A little more specifically than that, so for a trade agreement, the reason that we're talking about the geopolitical reality is that other countries want things, right? The meat industry, in Brazil, that's not something that like the EU wants or something, but it does constitute the issue that I was just talking about, right? It is a negotiation. There's two sides to that, obviously, sort of thing. So what else can we offer them? And I was citing the reason, the case that I know best about it in Uzbekistan, sort of thing, right? I mean, you have to give to get. If you want not only yourself to protect the environment, but also the rest of the planet to join with you, basically, sort of thing, right? Then what is it that you offer? So a little more specific in terms of an alternative, if there is anything, that would be great.
Well, one thought related to the trade agreement, the negotiations, they're largely pushed by the car industry in Europe. So there are a lot of interests not related to environmental aspects and social aspects that are actually driving the negotiations here, but the interest of lobby organizations, of big companies who have other interests. So one concrete aspect would be making these discussions much more transparent and include many more civil society organizations on both sides of the agreement partners, so that we can actually talk about, okay, do we include sustainability issues, make them more binding, and don't let these agreements be driven by the wishes of the lobby organizations of the industries, but rather by looking at, okay, what does the population actually want? What do we need?
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question, if anyone in the audience has one. Yes, please.
Yes, I think well-being, it's something that is not measured. We don't have a key performance indicator of well-being, so we don't care about growth or well-being. We believe that growth is done with production and delivery and distribution and production of value that will generate well-being. But actually, well-being is a very concrete experience. When you go and buy a house, you understand what is well-being, looking at the environment, which is an intangible value. So here the point, the balance, above all in our society, is to what extent we can lobby on well-being and who should lobby on well-being. As you said, usually is the civil society that is pushing for that. But in the very moment we don't have a criteria to manage, to weight, to value, to consider a trade, I think we have a point. And I'm referring to something that should enter somewhere in this discussion in the future.
May I add after you?
Okay. Please go ahead.
In this context, it's also interesting that while we agree, kind of, I have the feeling that, for instance, a very, very well-designed free trade agreement would provide value to the society. Right now, in most partner countries, also in the EU, but also in Mercosur, there are no political majorities for this, because the majority of people is rather so afraid of free trade that they say, no, go away. And so if we want to leverage free trade to also push forward our climate agenda, I think it's also important to get more people on board on this. Because if the majority of people says, okay, free trade destroys our jobs and there's no other way, we need to close, we need to be protectionist, then we really lose that leverage to push forward the climate agenda and also social agendas in people's rights. So there is it again that there has to be a lot of education on this as well.
I just want to mention there's some irony also to the debate, because if we get back to the Mercosur agreement from a macroeconomic point of view, the Mercosur agreement is little about growth. It has very moderate growth effects from a macroeconomic perspective. This is also underlined by the official impact assessment of the European Commission. If you're further interested, there was also a study commissioned by the Chamber of Labor, Assess Mercosur. And we have to be also aware that if we're speaking about growth or economic impact for whom? Of course, there are strong offensive interests in the European car industry. Of course, there are strong interests in the so-called extremist sectors in Brazil. But is this sustainable? And we already had the example about, is it sustainable to export and import even more beef around the globe? So I think there's another driver for optimism. And I'm working on trade issues for more than 10 years now, I think more intensively. There is some Zeitenwende in a different sense. Because 10 years ago, we had discussions about, is the sustainability chapter of a free trade agreement enforceable or not? Is it still only up to best endeavor clauses? And this is also a problem of the given Mercosur agreement. Or is there a strong enforcement mechanism? are sustainability criteria norms or second-class norms, or are they on an equal footing with trade provisions? But there is a change, because now we're discussing, are these trade agreements outdated because they are increasing CO2 emissions? This is not only an issue about the trade and sustainability chapter. It's about the heart of the matter. Do we need more beef exported and imported around the globe if we are serious about the climate crisis and well-being?
All right, I think with that, we wrap up the discussion for today. I thank all the speakers for their very interesting points and for this very fruitful discussion. Of course, as any sort of panel that looks at trade, we always are tied back to this. It's that there is no situation when there is no benefit from countries and state actors working through trade networks. Maybe now that environmental sort of sustainability becomes this variable, we've looked at 4 particular examples, whether it's looking at making sustainability a critical part of legal infrastructure and treaty regulations, whether it's value-based trade networks and relations that sort of encourage normative best practices, whether it's green growth and sort of decoupling growth from normal variables of pure energy efficiency and consumption, or whether it's looking at refocusing the discussion on preemptive planning instead of reacting to disasters. We've looked at different perspectives of how we can tie together trade, degrowth, and the environment. And with all of that being said, I thank the audience for their participation. I welcome them to look at the other panels that will be listed ahead, and I invite them to speak with our panelists at the coffee break, and I adjourn the session for today. Thank you all.